For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Ryhove. EISA Manager for Governance Institutions and Processes, Ebrahim Fakir, joins me in studio to discuss benchmarks for democratic governance in Africa. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Thank you.
Please provide an explanation of democracy and comment on whether democracy without political parties is possible.
Well, Shannon, if we all knew what democracy is, some of us would be out of business. And so the point I'm making is that I think democracy's meaning is unstable and it's constantly shifting, and it depends who means what when they invoke the term democracy. But there are 3 or 4 different elements when we talk about democracy. The first thing and the most obvious thing about democracy is that everyone, every citizen, every person has the equal ability to participate and to impact on the kind of decisions and shape the decisions or have a say on the decisions that affect them. And therefore they are at liberty, which is the other important word, and are free enough, which is the second important word, to be able to contribute to decisions that affect them and shape their own lives, in other words. And so that's the primary meaning of democracy. The second is, and some would say, but this is not democracy, but a system of democratic governance, which is putting in place a system by which people's participation, freedom, and liberty is codified. And by codification, we're invoking a set of rules. So there's a set of rules which would prescribe the system and the process by which people would participate, would contribute to decision making. Generally, we think of elections as one way, but participatory democracy, and the theory of democracy changed over time. Participatory democracy means that you could go and make submissions. You can interact with your public representatives at any of the levels at which they're elected. Being able to petition, being able to organize, the freedom to organize yourself, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience and belief. So to believe what you want, to organize on the basis of pursuing that belief and that interest, coming together to act in your collective interests, a set of individuals who do that. So those freedoms and that system, that process must allow for those things to happen. Then there's also the third aspect, placing limitations on the exercise of power, in which the system by which it is administered and executed would require that there are authorities in that system, in that process, who are responsible for administering and executing people's participation, people's freedom, people's liberty, taking the decisions and codifying them, taking the decisions and implementing them. And in the implementation of those decisions, that no one has the absolute power and absolute ability to be able to do whatever it is they choose. Because if that's the case, then particular elites, people who are strongest, will be able to do whatever they want to. And so there's a system of checks and balances, which we popularly call in the technical literature and otherwise the separation of powers. That means a check on the separation of the way in which people who make the laws, people who execute the laws, and people who judge whether the laws are good, bad, or properly applied are separated. So that's the 3 different definitions. And the fourth, which is embedded in all of the others, is the codification of fundamental rights: equality, freedom, expression, conscience, belief. Therein would fall freedom of the media. So all those freedoms, fundamental political rights, the liberty to act. That's the fourth aspect, which is embedded in the first 3. So as we can see, democracy means many different things. It means also that a majority, the popular will, which is the 5th aspect, that the popular will must prevail in the way in which a society is run, in which society is governed. Because if the majority of people want something, but it is held to ransom by a powerful minority, that means you're subverting and undermining an aspect of democracy. But if a majority makes decisions which are hurtful to a minority in a community, that's also not fair. And so you have built in another dimension to democracy, which is the acceptance that a majority or the popular will, or what is called popular sovereignty, will prevail and reign, but at the same time that there are protections for minority interests, minority groups. Now, if those are the 6 different aspects of democracy, and you're asking what role do political parties play, well, sometimes political parties, if you take one or other of those dimensions, would have no role to play. Because what you're talking about is the ability of ordinary people to associate, to come together and pressure and push for what they want, organize for what they want, and pursue what they want, or impact on decisions and impact on their own lives. And political parties may or may not have a role in that. But political parties then do come in because, one, when we spoke about the second aspect, the systematization, the proceduralization, the creation of a process by which participation is engendered, they'll come together as a set of collective interests. So it's people who form a political party because they want to pursue particular aims, particular goals, they share common interests, they share a set of common beliefs, so they aggregate these interests, they formalize them into a collective group, and they themselves then will pursue what they believe that set of interests are. That's how we believe political parties came into being, because they're just not a natural feature or a natural actor in society. They came about historically because people coalesced, associated with each other, and decided collectively we might better be able to pursue a certain number of goals and actions and aims and objectives. Now, can political parties or can democracies exist without political parties? Well, political parties can exist even in undemocratic states. So if a state which doesn't allow sufficient space for citizens to organize, they curtail fundamental freedoms, they are there and they are administering a state, or they captured power to such an extent that they basically rule the roost. And if you think about apartheid South Africa, or you think about certain autocratic societies, they may very well have political parties, but they may not be democratic.
Now, the central challenge of politics is a misplaced perception that one enters politics to get rich. Now, please elaborate on this statement, as well as how this could link to the possible corruption in political parties.
Well, I think this is also a modern idea, and it's a modern idea because historically, if you think about politics, one didn't just go into politics to get rich. One would go into politics to contest certain ideas, or to imprint on society a shape, form, a nature and a character of society in a particular way. And that's why you got into politics. So politics, if that's our definition, is about contestation. It's about competition of certain different ideas, different forms of society, different types of policy. So there's competition, there's contestation over what the nature and character of it should be. And then there could be open and deep conflict, intractable sometimes, which would lead to war. That's politics. It's about how you would take the resources in a society and allocate them across the board, how you would use them, for what purposes you would use them. But those must be based and are based on ideas. Now, of course, in the way in which society evolves, people go and acquire power or acquire influence, which is what a sub-definition in politics would be, of politics would be. So you acquire power and you acquire influence to imprint the nature and character of society, policy, the allocation of resources, and how it would happen, what it would be used for, what purposes. That we call economics, but it is still political. So I don't agree that people always get into politics simply because they are rational actors and they want to maximize what is in their own benefit, in their own interest, and minimize what is in their own discomfort and comes at a cost to them. I think sometimes people do get into politics because they want to pursue a particular ideal. Unfortunately, if we look at the way in which politics have evolved, at least across the African continent, there's large perceptions that elites have got into politics to acquire power and influence, and have done so purely to maximize what is in their own interests and in their own benefit, rather than to maximize benefit or the good of society in general. So it's a very lopsided definition and understanding of politics, but not far-fetched if people look at how the administration of politics, it's not politics itself, but the administration of politics, the administration of political power, once you have acquired it, that has not benefited society at large. The allocation of those resources, scarce or otherwise, have not happened beneficially for a large number of people. If you take South Africa as an example, some would say business is just as much of a rational actor as some of the corrupt politicians. And why is that the case? Because it appears as if politicians are using state power as a route to economic acquisition and as a route to a good life simply for themselves. But business elites are doing precisely the same thing. They are maximizing profits to such an extent that they are using this profit making simply to stockpile large amounts of money, engage in conspicuous consumption instead of using some of those profits. And the argument's not saying that they shouldn't make profits, but they should use a portion of the profits either to reinvest in businesses, to expand the economy, but also to create jobs. So they say, but there's rational actors on each side. So everyone who's in the game of power and everyone who's in the game of influence is simply maximizing what is in their own benefit. Now, across outside the rest of the continent, and maybe even in parts of the world now, if you look at the crisis in Europe, in the US, the economic crisis I'm talking about, people assume that political elites who have power, whether political power, power in business, economics, in the media, have basically used this to very selfish ends. And that's why we had the rise of this perception that people in power are merely in it for themselves. And this now, for government and for the ability to administer society, has very serious negative consequences, because the level of trust that ordinary people have of those in power and influence is diminished very low. And if we're talking about political parties, there's a global poll which has polled citizens around the world, in which citizens have said of all the institutions that they were tested on, business, the media, religious leaders, political parties, they ranked political parties lowest. And this was the International Gallup poll, which says across the world, on average, close to 6 or 7% of citizens only would trust a political party and have confidence that a political party would do what it says and promises that it would. And unsurprisingly, with the global financial crisis, business leaders have not come off and not fared much better in this poll. And the people who fared best are religious leaders and sometimes journalists.
Former Ghana President Jerry Rawlings suggested that measures need to be put in place to ensure that governments serve the people and that parties empower the people, as opposed to merely serving as vehicles for political office holders seeking personal gain and power. What measures does he suggest?
The measures he's referring to are largely in support of the benchmarks which were generated by participants from governing and opposition parties across the continent, which came together in a symposium. And those are the benchmarks I think he's suggesting. Some of them, if we can simply talk about them, is fundamentally the codification of fundamental political rights, so that citizens can associate. There's the fundamental freedoms that we spoke about that should exist in a democracy: the liberty to speak, believe, associate, think how you would like, to come together, to act in pursuit of those interests as you define them. So I think that's his first fundamental measure, as he suggests, and as we've codified as a benchmark. But this refers to a overall political system, not privately a set of measures that parties internally ought to put in place. And he suggests some of those too. But when he talks about the public system, the political system overall, or the political party system, he's saying there ought to be a constitutional or legal entitlement to the fundamental freedoms, firstly. Secondly, there has to be a subscription to an idea of openness, that there would be free and fair competition, and this competition would not be wild competition, unwritten, unregulated, with no rules, but there would be a set of rules which must be fair, which must be just, and which must have a sense of creating equal ability for people, organizations, if they want to come together, people want to come together to form those organizations to participate in competing for political power and for influence. He also suggests freedoms of the media. He makes suggestions about how institutions in government ought to function: effective separation of powers, checks and balances through oversight and requirements of accountability, fair rules in institutions for opposition political parties to be able to ask questions, to be able to deliberate on laws or bills or policies which actually go before these institutions. And lastly, that governments exist to serve society. I think very importantly, he had a phrase in his very long speech from which you took that extract, in which Jerry Rawlings speaks about the fact that politicians ought to start thinking of themselves as servants rather than as purely leaders. Because for a very long time, it doesn't appear as if people who are meant to be leading society were providing leadership to society. They weren't taking a society along with them to a particular kind of vision, to a certain set of ideas, which would make what we would call the good society. And so he says, well, perhaps to change that, politicians ought to think of themselves as servants, of people who are there to serve institutions, and the institutions are there to serve the people.
Well, thank you very much, Ebrahim. It's always nice to chat to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
That was Ebrahim Fakir from the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa, discussing democratic governance in Africa.